Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah smells like antiseptic and floor wax under flickering fluorescent lights that hum their monotonous song at 2 in the morning. Elena Martinez has worked the night shift here for 3 years, moving through the cardiac unit with the kind of economy of motion that comes from having learned to waste nothing, not time, not energy, not words. She's the kind of invisible that happens when you show up, do the work, and never ask for credit. Her scrubs are navy blue, standard issue, unremarkable. Her name tag is worn smooth from 3 years of being read by patients who forget it 5 minutes later. What they notice instead is that when Elena is in the room, things get better. Vitals stabilize. Pain decreases. The machine stops screaming. She carries a battered trauma kit in her locker that's far too advanced for a floor nurse, 14-gauge angiocath needles, a field-grade pressure dressing kit, a tourniquet marked with fading military call signs. No one asks about it. The night staff learned long ago not to question Elena's methods. They just learned to trust her the way soldiers trust the person next to them in a firefight. Her forearms are mapped with thin scars that she covers with long sleeves even in the brutal Savannah summer, even when the break room AC gives up and the heat becomes something you can taste. The scars are old. Very old. Some of them are the color of bone, which means they've been with her for at least a decade. She never talks about them. The staff stopped asking after the first month. Tonight, like every night, Elena moves through her assigned rooms with the precision of someone who has set up field stations under fire. Room for 12, 68-year-old male, 3 days post-op from aortic valve replacement, vitals holding steady at BP 118/76, heart rate 62. She checks his Swan-Ganz catheter with 2 fingers on the pressure line, reading the curve like sheet music, feeling for the subtle variations that tell a story about cardiac function that the monitors sometimes miss. The patient sleeps through it. Her touch is gentle but firm, the touch of someone who has held worse things than confusion and fear. She adjusts his flow by exactly 0.3 milliliters per hour because she can see in his face that his kidneys are starting to work harder and his fluid balance needs to shift. This is not in the doctor's orders. The doctor is asleep somewhere uptown in a house that costs more than Elena makes in 2 years. Room for 14, 42-year-old female, post-MI, day 2, anxiety spiking. Heart rate climbing to 94. Elena sits down, actually sits, when every other nurse in this hospital is running between rooms like they're being chased. She pulls the chair close to the bed and she just sits there. Doesn't speak. Doesn't make eye contact. Just sits with the woman's fear like it's a physical thing in the room that needs bearing witness. 2 minutes later, the heart rate drops to 82. The patient's breathing slows. The trembling in her hand stops. When Elena stands to leave, the woman grabs her wrist and says, "Thank you. I don't know what you did, but thank you." Elena nods once. That's all. She doesn't say you're welcome. She doesn't say everything will be fine. She just acknowledges that she was present for the worst part, and now it's slightly less worst, and that's enough. A Marine patient is recovering in room for 18, Private First Class Marcus Webb, training accident, separated shoulder, nothing life-threatening but the kind of injury that hammers at the ego of a 23-year-old whose identity is wrapped up in what his body can do. He watches Elena when she comes in to check his vitals. His eyes track her movements with a kind of tactical attention that you don't learn in a hospital. 2 fingers on the radial pulse at the wrist, exact pressure, checking for the bounding quality that indicates fever or sepsis. No extra motion. No wasted gesture. She's counting, he can see it in the slight pause, 60 beats in 1 minute, she's not even using the monitor, she's reading his pulse like ancient physicians read entrails. When she finishes, she catches him staring and he looks away fast, but there's recognition in that moment. Something in her hands. Something in the way she moves. Something in the absolute stillness of her face that says she's seen things that would break people like him. Her eyes are the color of old denim, faded from something brighter, and when she meets his gaze for just a second, there's no judgment there. Just acknowledgement. You know. I know you know. We won't talk about it. She moves on to his foresight, checking for infection, for infiltration, for the 1,000 small things that can go wrong in a single piece of plastic beneath skin. The 4 is perfect. Of course it is. Dr. James Pierce arrives for morning rounds at 6:33 a.m., and the entire energy of the floor shifts like a pressure system moving in from the Atlantic. His loafers are Italian leather, buffed to a shine that you could read instruments by, and they click on the linoleum with the sound of someone announcing his arrival before his body actually enters the room. He's 48, with the kind of tan that requires either a beach house or a tanning bed, and the kind of confidence that comes from never once being told no by anyone who mattered. His white coat is tailored, actually tailored, not just a coat that fits, and his stethoscope is draped around his neck like a decoration, the kind of thing that someone wears because it looks good rather than because they use it to listen to anything. He's carrying a tablet, very deliberately, and the residents trailing behind him are moving in formation like young soldiers trying to stay out of fire. Elena is updating the night shift notes at the central station when she catches sight of him in her peripheral vision. She doesn't look up. This is a learned skill, the art of making yourself smaller without actually moving, the art of being present without being present. She keeps her fingers on the keyboard, keeps her eyes on the screen, keeps her voice even and professional when one of the residents asks her a question about a patient's medication history. She answers in facts. Dates. Dosages. Numbers. No elaboration. No opinion. She's been a nurse long enough to know that doctors like Pierce don't actually want input from the floor staff. They want confirmation. They want yes, doctor. They want nodding and deference and the tacit acceptance that the letters after someone's name matter more than the hands that touch patients every single day. But Dr. Pierce notices her. He notices the way she doesn't perform nervousness. He notices that she's not straightening up or finding suddenly important work elsewhere when he approaches. He notices that when she does look up, there's no flattery in her eyes, no hope that he might be impressed with her competence. This infuriates him in a way he can't quite articulate, which makes it even worse. He's a man who has spent 48 years believing that excellence flows from credentials, from pedigree, from the right schools and the right family names and the right connections. He looks at Elena Martinez, who is built like someone who has moved furniture in high-altitude deserts, who carries herself with the kind of stillness that comes from having been in rooms where movement meant death, who commands the absolute respect of every person on this floor without ever asking for it, and he sees a threat he can't quite define. Morning rounds, he announces to no one in particular, and the residents snap into formation. They begin in room for 12, the post-op aortic valve patient, and Dr. Pierce reviews the chart with the kind of glance that takes in approximately nothing. He checks the patient's incision, perfectly healing, no infection, no signs of rejection, and he nods once, satisfied. But then he notices something. The foresight. It's in the forearm, at perfect angle, with exactly the right length of catheter exposed, secured with the kind of precise tape job that minimizes movement but maximizes visibility for monitoring. It's actually a work of art. A full line like that is the difference between a patient who needs 3 sticks over 3 days and a patient who never has to be stuck again. He knows this. He's just choosing not to acknowledge it. Who said this line, he asks, and his voice carries the tone of someone asking who left a mess in the break room. Elena did, one of the residents answers. During night shift, when the patient started showing early signs of infiltration in the previous site. The patient wasn't ordered for a new line, Dr. Pierce says, and his eyes narrow slightly. Who authorized this? The resident hesitates. The patient's lab showed. I'm asking who authorized a procedure that wasn't in my orders. Silence. The kind of silence that happens in hospitals when someone is about to learn a painful lesson about the hierarchy of medicine. But then Elena speaks from where she's been charting at the station, not moving closer, not approaching, just speaking from across the room with a kind of calm clarity that sounds like someone reading a grocery list. The patient was showing signs of infiltration. I prevented a failed foresight. If you want to reverse the decision, I can pull it. Dr. Pierce's head turns slowly. His eyes find her. And for a moment, something flickers across his face, something like recognition that he's just encountered someone who doesn't actually care about his opinion of her competence. She's not defending herself. She's offering him a choice. Either accept that good nursing happened on his shift, or undo it and look foolish. He hates this. He hates that she's right. He hates that the resident is now looking at Elena like she's just saved something important. He hates that a nurse with no degree beyond her RN, no prestige in her background, no connections that matter, has just demonstrated better clinical judgment than his own. It stays, he says finally, but his voice has changed. It's sharper now. Colder. But in the future, communicate with the attending before making changes to the treatment plan. Yes, doctor, Elena says, and her voice is smooth as glass, and she goes back to her charting, and the entire unit has just watched her acknowledge an order that wasn't actually necessary to acknowledge because she already made the right decision and everyone knows it. The rounds continue, and Dr. Pierce moves from room to room with the focused intensity of someone on a hunt. He's looking for something now. He's looking for a way to re-establish the natural order, the way the world is supposed to work when you have the right credentials and the right background and the right understanding that your letters matter more than someone else's hands. What he doesn't see, as he reviews chart after chart, is why every patient on Elena's shift is slightly more stable than the baseline. Why every foresight is perfect. Why every medication is perfectly timed. Why the night shift, the shift that doesn't get celebrated, the shift that happens in darkness when no one important is watching, runs with the smooth precision of a unit that trusts its floor staff to make life or death decisions. He doesn't see that. He just sees a nurse who has somehow made his morning rounds feel less important. And that's when the real problem begins. The grand rounds presentation began like every other Tuesday morning. Elena stood at the back of the conference room while Dr. Pierce commanded the center, 12 residents and 3 attending physicians arranged in a semicircle like courtiers awaiting judgment. She held a patient chart in her hands, the one from the MI case 3 nights ago, the one where she'd caught a subtle EKG change at 2:17 a.m. that the day's shift had missed. Pierce grabbed it from the rack without looking at her, held it up to the fluorescent light, and smiled that particular smile, the one that made the residents shift their weight. This, he said, his voice pitched to carry, is what happens when people above their station attempt to practice medicine. He tapped the cardiac assessment section with his index finger. Nurse Martinez here has documented a left-axis deviation interpretation. A cardiac assessment that belongs exclusively in a physician's note. Tell me, Martinez. He turned to face her directly. Where did you complete your medical degree? Oh, I forgot, did you even finish high school? The residents' eyes dropped to their shoes. One of them, a second year from Johns Hopkins, looked like he wanted to disappear into the linoleum. Elena's hands remained at her sides, perfectly still. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She simply stood there with a cold, flat stare, the kind of stare that comes from having looked into places most people never see. Pierce waited for a response, for trembling, for tears. He was still waiting when she turned and walked out of the room, past the residents, past the attending physicians, her footsteps steady on the tile floor. He called after her, "Don't walk away from me when I'm speaking, nurse." She didn't pause. What Pierce didn't understand about Elena was that humiliation requires a witness inside the soul. It requires the person being attacked to accept the premise that the attack is valid. Elena had learned long ago, in the mountains of the Hindu Kush under fire with rounds snapping past her head, that shame only existed if you internalized it. So she didn't internalize it. She simply filed it away, the way she filed away everything else, in that compartment where survival lived, separate from feeling, accessible when needed. 2 days later, Pierce orchestrated his second move. Elena was at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, the main corridor where foot traffic was heaviest, where residents and nurses and physicians all converged between shifts. She was reaching for a bottle of water when Pierce appeared, moving with the false casualness of a predator. He positioned himself so 3 residents could witness what was about to happen. His voice dropped to that particular register, loud enough to carry, soft enough to sound conversational to anyone not paying attention. "I'm calling security if you talk back to a physician again, Nightingale," he said, using the nickname he'd invented, the one that made him laugh alone in his office. Some of us earned our credentials through years of rigorous study, not weekend certification courses and YouTube tutorials. He gestured vaguely at her scrubs like they were evidence of fraud. You might have learned to memorize some protocols, but that doesn't make you a clinician. That makes you a technician with delusions. The vending machine hummed. Thunder rolled across the city outside, summer storm moving in from the coast. Elena pulled her water free and turned to face him. 3 residents stood frozen, pretending not to hear. A 4th had actually stopped walking, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. The difference between us, Dr. Pierce, Elena said, her voice low and steady and carrying that particular timbre, the one that made people listen whether they wanted to or not, is that I've held a human heart in my hands and felt it beat. She paused for exactly 1 second. Have you? She turned and walked away before he could respond, her footsteps echoing down the corridor like a metronome. Behind her, Pierce's face transformed, the color rising from his collar, his jaw working soundlessly. The residents suddenly found their shoes extremely interesting. One of them, the one with the coffee, actually smiled before catching himself. That smile would haunt Pierce more than any physical blow could have. It was recognition. It was the moment his authority fractured in front of witnesses, and everyone in the hallway understood it. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, Elena was called to the cardiac ward for a code blue, a Marine patient recovering from a training accident, a young sergeant with a chest wound that had required surgical intervention. His heart had begun to fibrillate, the monitor screaming its electronic alarm. Elena moved into the room and took position at his chest without waiting for instruction. Her hands found the landmarks with the kind of precision that belongs to muscle memory, that comes from having done this exact thing under conditions far more terrible than a climate-controlled hospital room. Her fingers positioned the heel of her hand over the xiphoid process, her shoulders squared, her compressions deep and steady at the correct rate, 100 per minute, mechanical and perfect. She counted silently. 1, 2, 3. The sound of her hands against his sternum was like the thud of a woodpile being split. 1, 2, 3. The monitor traced its deadly pattern. Flat line. Flat line. Then, electricity surged through his body. Sinus rhythm. The sergeant's eyes opened, glazed, and confused, his breathing shallow. Elena was already preparing the next intervention before the crash cart team had finished moving. The charge nurse called out vitals, BP climbing, O2 sat 89, heart rate stabilizing. Within 90 seconds it was over. The sergeant was stable. The crisis had passed. But as Elena leaned in to check his pupils, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but the words landed like a stone dropped in still water, "You're military. I've seen that exact technique in combat medics." Elena's hands froze. Just for half a second, barely long enough to notice. But the sergeant noticed. She met his eyes and shook her head once, the movement so small it might have been a trick of the fluorescent light. His grip on her wrist loosened. He nodded slowly, understanding something deeper than the words aloud, and said nothing more. When she straightened and stepped back from the bed, her composure had reassembled itself like a door closing. But inside, something had shifted. The secret that had lived safely in silence for 3 years had been glimpsed by someone with the eyes to see it. Elena had one certainty born from 18 years of military service: secrets that were seen could no longer be controlled. Dr. Pierce watched from the observation window. He hadn't been present during the code, he'd been in his office reviewing his investment portfolio, but the charge nurse had updated him within the hour. Code blue on a Marine patient. Elena had been the primary responder. Patient had stabilized. Everything by protocol. What bothered Pierce wasn't the outcome. It was the way the residents were talking about her after, the way they'd organized themselves around her during the code without anyone asking them to, the way the attending physician had stepped back and let a nurse, run a resuscitation. It was the way his authority had become invisible in that room while hers had become luminous. He sat at his desk in the darkened office and made a decision. Social attacks had failed. Public humiliation had backfired. The residents were no longer impressed by his credentials, they were watching how Elena moved and learning from her, which meant they were seeing through his performance. Which meant he needed to change tactics. He needed to move from embarrassment to strategy. He needed to start making calls. The phone on his desk sat in the darkness, waiting for him to pick it up. Dr. Harrison Barkley, the hospital board president and his fraternity brother from medical school, answered on the second ring. Behind him, Elena was writing notes on the Marine Sergeant's chart, documenting vitals and medications with the precision that had already saved 3 lives that night alone. She didn't know yet what was beginning. None of them did. At 2:19 a.m., the fluorescent lights flickered once. Elena didn't look up from her charting at the night desk. She'd seen electrical glitches before, old hospital, older wiring. Then the floor moved. Not swayed. Moved. A grinding, impossible motion that tilted the world sideways and sent her pen skittering across the desktop. The cardiac monitor beside her screamed in alarm as equipment lurched against restraints. She grabbed the desk edge. Muscle memory took over before thought did, her shoulders locked, her center of gravity dropped. Combat stance. The hallway lights cut to darkness. Both of them. Emergency backup kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in that sickly red emergency glow that turned the hospital into something from a nightmare. Alarms. Everywhere alarms. Ventilators shrieking. Heart monitors wailing. The intercom popped with static and nothing, no voice, no instructions, just the hiss of air escaping from somewhere deep in the building's bones. The second earthquake hit like a truck with teeth. The tile beneath Elena's feet buckled. A window across the waiting room exploded in a shower of glass that sounded like ice cracking on a frozen lake. The ceiling tiles fell. One hit the chair where she'd sat 30 seconds earlier. She was already moving, already knowing without being told that the shaking meant structural failure, meant collapses, meant the hospital had just become a disaster site. The sounds told her everything, that deep, terrible grinding of concrete under pressure, the shriek of rebar twisting like spine vertebrae in a car wreck, the crash and dust roar of something massive coming down. The surgical wing. It had to be. The cardiac unit was on the opposite side. The surgical wing was older. The surgical wing was where Dr. Pierce would be doing elective cases during day shift turnover prep. Her hand moved to the trauma kit mounted under the desk. Years of training recognized the signature sound of structural failure. Decades of military conditioning recognized what came next. Wounded. Buried. Dead weight to move. Hours of work before dawn. The third aftershock knocked her into the wall. Pain flared along her ribs where a monitor had crushed her against the desk frame. Not broken. Bruised. Data. Pain was information. The world shifted again, smaller this time, the Earth's tantrum diminishing but still deadly. In the emergency lighting, Elena could see patients stumbling into the hallway from their rooms, some bleeding, most confused. Behind her, down the west corridor, nothing but dust. A roiling cloud of it, illuminated by emergency lights like something alive. The dust smelled like pulverized drywall and copper and ozone and something else, something like burnt electronics. The air pressure had changed, that strange vacuum suck feeling that meant a building had just lost its structural integrity. She heard crying. Distant. Muffled. Someone was under the rubble. Someone was alive under the rubble and calling out. Elena moved toward it. Her feet carried her past the patients needing triage, past the nurses emerging from the break room looking shell-shocked. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody tried to organize her. The hospital had shifted into chaos in the span of 10 seconds, and in chaos, people followed whoever moved with certainty. She grabbed the trauma kit from its wall mount, then the surgical shears from her pocket, the ones with the call sign engraved into the handle, the one she'd carried since her discharge. The one she'd kept hidden under the lining of her work jacket for 12 years. She didn't think about that. She moved into the dust. The hallway was gone. The surgical wing wasn't collapsed, it was pulverized. Concrete had pancaked, one floor pressing down onto another with the force of gravity multiplied. Dust hung in the red emergency light like a living thing. She could hear groaning. Equipment beeping beneath the rubble. Someone screaming, then cutting off abruptly. The surgical suite had been for stories of state-of-the-art equipment and precision. Now it was a tomb of broken angles and twisted metal and human hurt. Elena climbed over the first debris pile, concrete blocks that weighed what a car weighs, stacked like children's toys. She could see a hand. A woman's hand, small, pale, covered in dust. Dr. Pierce's surgical resident. She wasn't moving. "I'm here," Elena said. Not a shout. A command. The kind of voice that carried authority through gunfire and explosions. The kind of voice that made people believe help had arrived. "Tell me what you can move." The hand didn't move. Elena kept climbing. She found the resident under a support beam, the crushing weight of it across her lower abdomen. Not survivable damage if left. Survivable if time moved faster than bleeding. Elena had 30 minutes before hypovolemic shock became irreversible. She might have 10. She began moving the lighter debris. Wooden framing. Acoustic tile. Dust fell like snow. Behind her, she heard other voices now. Hospital staff were mobilizing. The parking lot was becoming a triage area. She could hear shouting, see emergency vehicles arriving through the dust clouds. The aftershock had lasted 47 seconds. That meant other hospitals in the city were being hit too. That meant resources would fragment, spread thin, get overwhelmed. That meant the people under this rubble had only her? She found a combat knife in her cargo pocket, old muscle memory, keeping field equipment in work clothes. The blade had served her in the Hindu Kush. It had never needed to serve her in Savannah. She used it to cut through the resident's uniform, exposing the wound. Abdominal trauma. Lacerated vessels. The kind of injury that would have killed her 20 years ago would have certainly killed her 30 minutes from now, but Elena's hands had moved this way 312 times before. In a field hospital in Uruzgan province. In a combat medevac. In the kind of darkness where death arrived if you flinched. A flashlight appeared. A security guard, hand shaking badly enough that the light danced. "What do you need?" "Steady hands," Elena said. "Can you?" He swallowed. Nodded. She guided his hands to compression points, showed him where to apply pressure. The resident's eyes were rolling back. Shock setting in. The grinding, terrible sound of another aftershock rolled through the building, smaller, the building still settling, still deciding how much more of itself it wanted to drop. Elena opened the trauma kit with one hand, found a 14-gauge angiocath needle, found access in the brachial vein. She was moving on instinct now, her conscious mind quiet as prayer. The kind of quiet that came from having done this when the alternative was letting people die. The needle went in. The hiss of air, just the fluid moving into the fall line, but Elena heard it as a sound of hope. She pushed fluid. Warm saline, running wide open. Type O negative from the emergency kit. She'd already known what blood type mattered. Combat medicine in a mass casualty event meant knowing the percentages, knowing that O negative survived in more bodies than any other blood. "Stay with me," she said to the resident, though the woman couldn't hear her. Elena was talking to herself. Talking to the part of her that had learned to function when the alternative was failing. 30 seconds. That's all we need. She found the knife again. The wound needed opening, needed exploration. Elena moved with the precision of someone who'd done this under fire, who'd learned to ignore the percussion of outgoing artillery and incoming mortars and the screams of the Marines around her. She opened the abdomen. She found the bleeder, a lacerated hepatic artery, the kind of wound that killed people in minutes. She clamped it with a tourniquet made from trauma shears. The kind of field medicine that wouldn't survive any textbook review, would get her license revoked if anyone ever knew, would get her court-martialed if her old unit ever found out she'd broken cover. The resident's blood pressure, which had been 70/40, began to climb. 78/45. 82/48. The kind of climb that meant she might survive until they got her to an operating room. The kind of climb that meant Elena had 30 seconds to spare. The guard was crying. He didn't know why, our shock, probably, or the simple human terror of watching someone bleed. Elena wrapped the field thoracotomy closure with the trauma kit's bandaging. For minutes and 17 seconds. She'd saved this life in less time than it took to order coffee. She stays in position, Elena said. No movement. Your hands stay exactly where they are on that compression point. What about? I'll send someone. Don't move. Elena climbed back out of the wreckage. The parking lot had transformed into a field hospital without physicians. 2 nurses, Jenny and Marcus, from the ER night shift, were organizing patients on the pavement. Car headlights and phone flashlights created islands of visibility in the pre-dawn darkness. She could see at least 18 people already triaged. Some sitting upright, walking wounded. Some lying down, conscious but injured. Some so still that Elena's mind categorized them as expectant, the term nobody said out loud but everyone understood. Comfort care only. The morphine would come, the kind hand of a nurse, but no aggressive intervention. The dust was settling now. The red emergency lights had failed, and daylight was maybe 40 minutes away. Elena moved through the parking lot with the kind of authority that made people step back. She found the charge nurse, Dr. Williams, one of the good ones, the kind who led instead of administered. We need a trauma surgeon in the collapsed surgical wing, Elena said. Abdominal laceration. 4th-year resident. She's stable-ish, but she needs a proper OR. Everyone's responding to other calls. This earthquake hit a 4-block radius. Mercy General is coordinated. I'll keep her stabilized until transport. What else? Dr. Williams looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, seemed to actually register that Elena's scrubs were covered in dust and blood, that her hands were moving with the kind of precision that didn't belong to someone who just triaged a disaster. But there was no time to ask questions. He pointed to the parking lot. 27 confirmed casualties in this sector. Most are walking wounded, but we have at least 6 with serious trauma. We're trying to establish treatment stations by vehicle, but we don't have enough personnel to. Elena was already moving. She'd done this before. She'd done this in Kandahar province with a burnt-out clinic and no electricity and the sound of incoming fire close enough that you could feel the pressure waves. She'd coordinated triage for 214 casualties across 6 grid squares. 27 was mathematics. It was systems. It was the kind of work that felt like breathing when you trained for it. She organized the parking lot into 3 treatment zones using the remaining vehicles' headlights. She positioned ambulatory patients in one area, instructed them to apply pressure to their own wounds with gauze from the supply carts. She moved the serious trauma cases into a second zone, assigned nurses to each one, gave quiet commands that sounded like questions. Can you manage the airway on that one? Yes. Watch his O2 sat, looks like pneumothorax. Understood. The third zone, the expectant zone, she filled with blankets and pain medication. Nobody said the words out loud. Nobody had to. The code had been understood by medical professionals for 100 years. A Marine stood at the edge of the parking lot. Elena had seen him before, the patient she'd treated 3 days ago, the one who'd recognized her military bearing. He was in hospital scrubs, uninjured, watching her work. His eyes had changed. Recognition. Something deeper than recognition. Something like seeing a ghost come back to life. Dr. Pierce emerged from the collapsed surgical wing at 6:23 a.m., exactly 1 hour and 36 minutes after the earthquake hit. He was disheveled, covered in dust, his left arm hanging at an odd angle. Dislocated shoulder, Elena's brain registered. Painful but not dangerous. His face was pale, shock, probably, or the simple human terror of having nearly died. He stumbled toward the triage area, and his eyes found Elena immediately. Not in gratitude. In calculation. She was covered in blood, not hers. Her hands were steady. The staff was deferring to her. The nurses were following her commands without question. The Marine General, because that's what his rank insignia said, what his bearing announced, what his eyes confirmed, was watching her with a look that said he understood exactly what he was seeing. A soldier who'd come home and put on scrubs and tried to disappear into a normal life. Pierce's mind was working. Elena could see it moving behind his eyes. The way his injury straightened slightly. The way his panic began to recalibrate into something more dangerous. Survival instinct. Strategic thinking. He had 3 hours before the state investigation teams arrived, 3 hours before the federal disaster assessment protocols kicked in, 3 hours before the narrative of this event got written down in official reports. He reached for his phone. His hand shook, but his jaw set with the kind of determination that had nothing to do with his injuries. Elena watched him as she checked the blood pressure on a patient with a compound tibia fracture. She already knew what was beginning. She'd seen strategic thinking in the eyes of men with power before. She'd seen how quickly gratitude could become blame, survival could become sabotage. But that wasn't the worst part. As the sun rose over the broken hospital and the dust finally settled and the emergency response teams began their impossible work, Elena found herself thinking about her son. About how she would explain to a 12-year-old that his mother had just saved lives in a way that couldn't be explained without destroying the identity she'd built to keep him safe. About how one earthquake had lasted 47 seconds, but its aftermath would last far longer. By 10 a.m., before the state investigator had even finished his preliminary assessment, Dr. Pierce had already made 4 phone calls. By noon, Elena was called to the director's office. Her keycard was deactivated before she could even ask why. Elena sat at her kitchen table in surgical scrubs still damp with other people's blood. Concrete dust caked her hair like ash. The kitchen light hummed overhead, too bright, too clinical. Her hands rested on the laminate surface, palms down. Steady. They'd always been steady. A dried smear of someone else's O negative crossed her left wrist where the latex glove had torn during chest compressions. She stared at it without moving. Muscle memory wanted to scrub. Protocol demanded decontamination. But she couldn't move. Wouldn't move. The earthquake had lasted 43 seconds. She'd saved 3 lives in that window. A patient with a crushing sternal fracture. Another with tension pneumothorax. A third whose arrhythmia she'd converted with nothing but adrenaline and a defibrillator running on backup batteries. The surgical wing ceiling had come down in sections, concrete the color of bone. She'd crawled through the wreckage with a trauma kit and her old combat knife, the one she'd sworn she'd never use again, and performed a field thoracotomy by flashlight while the earth kept moving beneath her hands. 30 seconds into her termination paperwork, she'd thought about her son. 40 minutes into coordinating triage in the parking lot, she'd thought about bills. Now, sitting in her kitchen at 9:11 p.m., 3 days after the earthquake, with Pierce's sabotage complete and her keycard deactivated before lunch, she thought about nothing at all. The front door opened. Marcus, 12 years old, walked in carrying his backpack and the specific weight of a child who'd just been told something was wrong. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. Saw her in the scrubs. Saw her face. Mom. His voice had that high quality it got when he was afraid. Why are you home early? Elena looked at her hands. The blood was dry now. Oxidized. The color of rust. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Tried again. Nothing came. The words that would explain everything, the earthquake, the surgery, the sabotage, the firing, all lived in classified space. In compartments marked eyes only and need to know. In places she'd spent 8 years learning never to speak about out loud. I'm okay, she said finally. The lie tasted like copper. Marcus set his backpack down slowly. He was tall now, taller than he'd been at Christmas. When had that happened? She'd missed so much time at night, sleeping during the day. sleeping while Pierce had spent the last 72 hours on the phone. "You're crying," Marcus said. Elena hadn't realized. But yes, her face was wet. Her shoulders were shaking in that small, controlled way they did when she was breaking apart at the molecular level but not letting the structure collapse outward. She'd learned that technique in the Hindu Kush. The art of disintegrating silently. Of holding everything together while everything fell apart inside. Marcus moved to her. Sat down across from her at the kitchen table. Neither of them spoke. He reached out and took her hand, the one with the blood still on it, the one she hadn't washed, and held it like she'd held patients' hands during their final moments. "Whatever it is," Marcus said, "we'll fix it." She couldn't tell him about the captain's rank she'd sworn to never claim. Couldn't tell him about the unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, the one that proved she'd commanded soldiers in places that officially didn't exist. Couldn't tell him that the hospital she'd bled for, the one she'd saved in the rubble, had fired her that morning for doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. What she could tell him was, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." 3 days earlier, the moment Elena had coordinated the last casualty evacuation in the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot, dawn breaking orange and poisonous over Savannah, Dr. Pierce had walked into the hospital director's office and made his first phone call. His hands had been shaking. She'd noticed that. His shoes had been clean. Unmarked. He'd been in the basement reading room when the ceiling came down on the surgical wing. He'd been safe. He'd let for patient's code while he sat in the dark, hyperventilating. The call was to Marcus Rothschild, the hospital board president. They'd been fraternity brothers at Emory Medical School 23 years ago. Close enough that Pierce knew which bourbon Rothschild preferred. Close enough that Rothschild answered on the second ring, even at 6:15 a.m., even after a citywide earthquake. "It's Richard," Pierce had said. His voice had sounded like something that needed to be defibrillated. "We have a serious problem." By 7:24 a.m., Pierce had called Elena's 3 references, one from her community college RN program, one from her first job at a clinic in Jacksonville, one from a travel nursing stint in Chicago. Sparse. Deliberately sparse. Carefully curated to show competence and nothing else. No one who would know her. No one connected to her life before. "I need to report a serious breach in protocol," he told each one. "During last night's emergency, one of our nurses, Elena Martinez, performed surgical interventions well beyond her scope. Unauthorized procedures. Patient endangerment. I'm documenting this officially." The investigators had arrived by 10:51 a.m. A man in a gray suit from the state medical board, clipboard in hand, eyes like a calculator. He'd interviewed nurses. He'd reviewed charts. He'd found exactly what Pierce had arranged for him to find, Elena's charting from the emergency, which was perfect, which was damning. Because perfect charting during a level 4 crisis meant someone was making decisions beyond a nurse's authority. By noon, Elena's key card no longer worked. She'd tried to swipe into the medication room and felt the electronic lock reject her. A security guard had appeared within seconds, not unplanned, she thought, watching it unfold with the cold clarity that came when survival instincts engaged. The guard had simply stood there. Not hostile. Just present. The visual of it was enough. A hospital administrator had handed her a sealed envelope. Administrative leave, pending investigation. Keycard deactivated immediately. The envelope was heavy with the weight of institutional power. With the weight of years of accumulated rules that existed specifically to protect doctors and sacrifice nurses. She couldn't defend herself. That was the architecture of it. If she'd explained that she was a Marine captain, that she'd run field hospitals under fire in the Hindu Kush, that she'd been ordered into deep cover after her unit's operation was classified above top secret, she would have violated every NDA she'd ever signed. She would have surfaced herself. She would have become visible. And visibility meant extraction. It meant being pulled back into the machinery she'd spent 8 years being promised would never activate again. "You can request a hearing," the administrator had said. "Kind man." Genuinely sympathetic. Completely powerless to stop this. If you'd like representation, now would be the time to contact. I understand, Elena had said. Her voice had been flat. Professional. The voice of someone who'd already practiced this decision in her head 100 times. She'd walked out of Cedar Creek Medical at 12:34 p.m. The same way she'd walked in at 11:53 p.m. for her shift, 4,807 nights in a row. The eucalyptus smell of the parking lot. The humidity of Savannah in September. The distant sound of sirens still running because the earthquake had triggered 100 emergencies at once and there was only one hospital. Now she sat with her son's hand on hers, blood on her skin, concrete dust in her hair, and realized she had no way to explain the geography of what had just happened. No way to tell him that the hospital had fired her, the state was investigating her, and she was bound by national security orders not to defend herself. That was the trap, wasn't it? The whole elegant trap. People like her, people with classified past operations, could be destroyed with a single phone call, and they couldn't fight back. Couldn't speak. Couldn't explain. Could only sit in their kitchens with their children's hands in theirs and let the machinery grind forward. Mom, Marker said quietly. It's going to be okay. Elena squeezed his hand. One small pressure, all the reassurance she could truthfully give. The rain had started outside. September rain in Savannah was warm and violent and came from the Atlantic in sheets. She could hear it hitting the porch roof, that sound like applause from an audience watching everything you built come down. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Pierce wasn't finished. Pierce had made his calls, yes. Pierce had activated the machinery, yes. But Pierce didn't know that the Marine General Elena had saved during the earthquake, the one who'd recognized her technique during chest compressions, who'd whispered, "You're military," had made one call of his own. General Hayes had one call that Pierce would never see coming. One call that would start the entire machinery running the opposite direction. The conference room door burst open at 2:36 p.m., the same timestamp the earthquake had struck 3 days earlier. Elena's 16-year-old son stood in the doorway, trembling not from fear but from the weight of the shadow box he held, mahogany wood, glass front, medals arranged on burgundy velvet like proof of a life nobody was supposed to know about. His voice cracked. "Mom, they need to see these. You can't let him do this." The 3 board members looked up from their files. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but the door opened wider. The Marine General stepped out from behind Elena's son, a man with silver stars on his shoulders and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He was tall, moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, and his eyes found Elena across the conference table like a compass finding north. He whispered one word. Phantom. Her old call sign. The one burned into classified documents. The one buried in operations files marked above top secret. The room froze. A Marine colonel in dress blues moved forward, took the shadow box from Elena's son with ceremonial precision, and opened his mouth to speak. His voice carried the weight of every word. Captain Elena Martinez, the colonel began, and the title hit like a detonation charge. For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush, where she performed 17 surgical procedures under direct fire, stabilized 14 critically wounded personnel, and maintained field hospital operations under sustained enemy fire for 72 consecutive hours. He paused. One sentence. One beat. Let it breathe. Bronze Star for Valor. Another pause. The board members leaned forward. Dr. Pierce's face flushed crimson. Silver Star. The colonel's voice never wavered. 2 purple hearts. The medals caught the fluorescent light and scattered it across the table like shattered glass. And a Navy Cross. That last one landed like a fist. The Navy Cross. The second highest medal awarded to the military services. Reserved for extraordinary heroism. Reserved for people who'd done the impossible and lived. Elena's eyes never moved. Her hand stayed flat on the table, palms down, steady as surgical steel. Dr. Pierce stood up. His chair scraped backward with a sound like nails on concrete. "This is absurd. She's a nurse, not a—" His voice was high, panicked, the sound of a man watching his entire constructed reality collapse. The general held up his hand. Not a request. It was a command. The salute that followed was executed with such precision it seemed to make the air pressure change around them. His fist struck his chest, the sharp metallic thud of respect meeting respect. When he spoke again, his voice was ice over deep water. Captain Martinez was ordered into deep cover after her unit's operation was classified above top secret. Her service record is sealed under presidential directive. She has spent 8 years as an invisible soldier in a civilian hospital, saving lives no one will ever know about, while serving her country in a way that required her to erase herself. He lowered his hand. "Dr. Pierce, you have spent 8 years tormenting a captain of the United States Marine Corps who could have destroyed you with a single phone call and chose not to. That ends now." The video conference monitor flickered to life. A man in a Pentagon liaison uniform appeared, his face pixelated slightly by the connection, but his authority undeniable. He carried a classified file. "Captain Elena Martinez, call sign Phantom, service record confirmed. Operation Silent Angel, cleared for acknowledgement as of this date. Code name, confirmed. Security clearance, updated to top secret SCI. All records corroborated." He nodded. The captain's service is now a matter of official record. The liaison disconnected. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. But that wasn't the moment that destroyed Dr. Pierce. That came when the phone call started spreading across the internet at 4:13 p.m. A resident named Sarah Chen had recorded it. The vending machine confrontation. Dr. Pierce's voice, loud and slurred with contempt, echoing off tile. Him screaming at Elena by the coffee machine. "Did you even finish high school?" Him threatening to call security if she talked back to a physician again. The video was 16 seconds long. It went up on Med Twitter at 4:17 p.m. By 6:11 p.m. it had 12,000 views. By 8:44 p.m. it had reached medical schools in 40 states. Nurses flooded the comments with their own stories. A respiratory therapist from Jacksonville. An ICU nurse from Atlanta. A surgical tech from Charleston. All of them describing the same pattern. The same contempt. The same weaponized arrogance. The same voice that demanded deference while offering nothing in return. By 11:36 p.m., Dr. Robert Kensington saw it. Decorated Army surgeon. The man who trained field medics in Vietnam. The man who taught Dr. Pierce in medical school. The man whose letters of recommendation had launched Pierce's career. Kensington watched the 16-second video of his former student screaming at a nurse and felt something break open inside him. He wrote a statement. Posted it at 11:22 p.m. His words were brief and they were final. "I taught Dr. Pierce that medicine is service. That a doctor exists to heal. To lift up. To honor the silent work of nurses who are the true guardians of patient care. I taught him this. He learned nothing. He is no longer my student. He is no longer welcome in my house. I no longer recognize him as a physician of integrity. He is a cautionary tale. He is a warning. He is what happens when arrogance replaces competence." The hospital board convened an emergency meeting at midnight. By 2:44 a.m. they had 6 formal complaints. By dawn, 8. Nurses who'd been too terrified to speak, too worried about retaliation, suddenly had permission to tell the truth. The state medical board opened an investigation by noon. Pierce's wife moved out that afternoon. His practice referrals dried up like paper in fire. By the end of the week he was removed from grand rounds, barred from teaching residents, stripped of his appointment as chief of cardiology. His attorney negotiated a severance package. $500,000 to resign quietly, to not contest the board's findings, to disappear. He chose a community college in North Florida. CPR certification classes. Bored healthcare aides checking their phones while he demonstrated chest compressions on a rubber dummy with hands that used to shake patients' hands at fundraisers. Designer loafers replaced with discount sneakers. Nobody asked for his autograph. Nobody called him doctor with the reverence he'd once demanded. His medical license was suspended pending the state investigation's conclusion. The medical community had a long memory, and forgiveness was not a currency Pierce had any remaining credit to spend. Elena was reinstated with full back pay. $147,000. The board issued a formal apology. General Hayes personally requested her as a consultant for a Marine medical training program at Camp Lejeune. Her security clearance was updated. She could finally exist in the light. No more shadows. No more pretending. No more erasure. 6 months later, she stood in her Marine dress blues at the Pentagon. The ceremony recognized service members whose classified operations could finally be acknowledged. A 4-star general moved down the line of uniformed personnel, and when he reached Elena, he pinned a commendation on her chest for her years of silent service. Her 16-year-old son stood beside her in a suit he was already outgrowing, and when the general finished, the boy saluted her. Clumsy but earnest. The cameras flashed. Reporters called her name. And on her jacket, visible now for the first time in 8 years, was the faded unit patch she'd kept sewn inside the lining all those years. A stylized angel with wings made of surgical instruments. The insignia of Operation Silent Angel. The proof that she'd always been who she was, even when the world wasn't allowed to know. The general shook her hand and told her the Marine she'd saved during the earthquake was returning to active duty because of her. Because she'd held his heart in her hands and felt it beat. Because she'd given him a second chance at being a soldier. Elena's smile then was genuine, unguarded, the first one like that we'd seen from her, and it changed her entire face. That's the thing about quiet people who've seen the worst. When they finally smile, the light comes back to everything around them. Subscribe to see more untold stories of classified service members working invisibly within civilian institutions. Like if you believe quiet competence deserves recognition. Comment with your own story of being underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value. And share this with someone who needs to hear it.